Hi everyone. Detective Lefebre speaks. It started as a routine drug bust. Officers raided a stash house in a quiet suburban neighborhood after receiving a tip-off. The house was modest and nondescript, blending into its surroundings. Inside, the suspects were caught red-handed with packages of cocaine, unregistered firearms, and a substantial amount of cash. However, something far more alarming was discovered. A folder containing handwritten notes detailing law enforcement activities. The notes weren't generic. They included detailed patrol schedules, descriptions of surveillance techniques, and even personal information about specific officers. One entry read, Unit 12B, watches Southside between 11:30 and 12 o'clock, uses alley off Maple Street. Another listed the names of undercover officers assigned to an unrelated operation. This wasn't just insider knowledge. It was evidence that someone with a law enforcement background was feeding the gang critical information. When questioned, one of the suspects, a low-level dealer named Hector, let something slip. "You'll never catch him," he said. "Ghost knows all your tricks." The nickname intrigued us. Ghost implied someone who operated invisibly, a figure who could evade detection while running the show. As the pieces began to fall into place, an unsettling picture emerged. Our adversary wasn't an ordinary gang leader. He was someone who understood us as well as we understood ourselves. The first step was identifying who Ghost might be. Hector's vague remarks about an ex-cop immediately put the department on edge. A search through internal records revealed several former officers who had left under suspicious circumstances. But one name stood out, Daniel Cortez. Cortez had served on the force for nearly 10 years and had been regarded as a skilled but controversial officer. Known for his tactical acumen and unflinching confidence, Cortez had been a rising star in the department. However, 3 years earlier, he had been accused of having ties to local gangs. An internal investigation turned up circumstantial evidence, large unexplained deposits in his bank account and rumors of him tipping off suspects about impending raids. The case was ultimately inconclusive, and Cortez resigned under a cloud of suspicion. After leaving the force, he vanished from public view. A deeper investigation into Cortez's post-policing life revealed a troubling pattern. He had maintained connections with several individuals known to be involved in organized crime, and his name came up frequently in surveillance reports, though never conclusively. It didn't take long for us to connect the dots. Daniel Cortez wasn't just associating with criminals, he had become one. To confirm our suspicions, we launched a covert surveillance operation. Cortez's last known address was a modest single-story house on the edge of the city, but he rarely appeared to live there. Instead, our surveillance teams observed him frequenting a warehouse in a rundown industrial district. The warehouse was nondescript, with rusting metal siding and no visible signage. Its exterior gave no clues, but the activity around it raised red flags. Cars arrived and departed at odd hours, often driven by individuals with known criminal records. Cortez's movements were methodical. He never took the same route twice and often performed counter-surveillance maneuvers, such as pulling into parking lots and waiting to see if he was being followed. He switched vehicles frequently, using rentals or borrowed cars to avoid detection. Despite his caution, our team captured footage of Cortez meeting with known gang members inside the warehouse. These meetings were brief, and he often exited with a locked briefcase or a backpack. The surveillance also revealed a curious pattern. Cortez often left the warehouse shortly after significant criminal activities, such as drug shipments or extortion payments. This indicated he wasn't just a participant, he was orchestrating operations from behind the scenes. However, his knowledge of police tactics made it clear that catching him would require more than just observation. Cortez's time on the force had given him an intimate understanding of how law enforcement tracks criminal finances, but no system is perfect. We began tracing the gang's money trail, focusing on deposits and transfers that seemed out of place. The investigation revealed a network of shell companies registered under fictitious names and addresses. One company, Iron Shadow Logistics, was particularly suspicious. It claimed to provide transportation services but had no vehicles, no employees, and no legitimate revenue streams. However, its bank account showed steady deposits from businesses suspected of laundering money for the gang. Digging deeper, we discovered Iron Shadow's account was linked to a P.O. box rented by Cortez under an alias. The company had received nearly $750,000 in the past year alone, much of it routed through cash-heavy businesses like bars and auto repair shops, classic fronts for money laundering. Cortez's fingerprints were all over these operations, even if he tried to hide behind layers of financial complexity. Cortez's paranoia and deep understanding of police procedures made traditional undercover tactics risky. He would likely spot an inexperienced operative immediately, so we needed someone who could match his sophistication. We brought in Agent David, a seasoned undercover officer with a history of successfully infiltrating organized crime groups. Posing as a mid-level drug supplier looking to expand his operations, David slowly integrated himself into the gang's network. This wasn't a quick process. Cortez's lieutenants were highly selective about who they let into their inner circle. David spent months building credibility, earning the trust of the gang's lower-level members by participating in minor deals and showing a convincing willingness to operate under the gang's rules. The breakthrough came when David was invited to a meeting with Cortez himself. The meeting took place inside the warehouse, where Cortez laid out plans to expand the gang's territory. He spoke with authority and precision, using language that betrayed his law enforcement background. Terms like surveillance perimeter and logistics choke points weren't part of the typical gangster lexicon. They were proof that Cortez was using his police training to stay ahead of us. The meeting was recorded, giving us concrete evidence of Cortez's leadership role within the gang. It also revealed his ambition. He wasn't content to operate locally. He wanted to expand, and his next moves could escalate the gang's operations to a national scale. Understanding Daniel Cortez was as much a psychological challenge as it was a logistical one. We enlisted the help of a criminal psychologist who specialized in profiling individuals with law enforcement backgrounds who had crossed into criminality. The psychologist's insights would prove critical in predicting Cortez's moves and dismantling his operation. Building the profile. Cortez had been a standout officer early in his career. His tactical acumen, sharp instincts, and methodical nature made him an asset in high-pressure situations. However, his personnel file revealed troubling details. Cortez was highly competitive, often clashing with peers and superiors over methods and decisions. He sought recognition but resented authority, particularly when it came from individuals he considered less competent. When Cortez resigned under suspicion of corruption, it wasn't just a career setback, it was a blow to his identity. The psychologist theorized that his descent into organized crime was fueled by a mix of resentment, a desire for power, and a need to prove his superiority. By leading a criminal organization, Cortez had created an environment where he was untouchable, operating outside the rules and restrictions he had once chafed against. The role of the badge. Cortez's law enforcement background wasn't just a tactical advantage, it was a source of personal pride. He viewed his knowledge of police procedures as a weapon, one he could wield against his former colleagues. This mindset explained his penchant for targeting law enforcement during his criminal activities. He wasn't simply evading detection. He was actively testing and outsmarting the system he once upheld. Paranoia and control. Another key aspect of Cortez's personality was his paranoia. He trusted no one fully, not even his closest lieutenants. He employed strict compartmentalization within his gang, ensuring that no single individual had a complete picture of his operations. The psychologist noted that this paranoia stemmed from his time on the force, where he had learned that trust could be easily exploited. Cortez's need for control extended to every aspect of his criminal enterprise. He meticulously planned operations, often creating contingency plans for potential failures. His perfectionism made him difficult to predict, as he rarely followed the patterns typical of gang leaders. This insight informed our strategy. We needed to exploit his need for control and overconfidence in his abilities. Cortez's gang was unlike the traditional organized crime groups we had encountered. Its structure reflected his background and approach, a hybrid of military precision and corporate efficiency. This made the gang both highly effective and difficult to penetrate. Decentralized leadership. Cortez avoided the typical hierarchical model of gang leadership. Instead of placing himself at the center, he created a decentralized structure. Lieutenants were responsible for specific aspects of the operation, such as drug distribution, weapons trafficking, or money laundering. Each lieutenant operated independently, reporting to Cortez only when necessary. This setup insulated Cortez from the day-to-day activities of the gang, making it harder to tie him directly to illegal operations. The lieutenants were selected not for their loyalty, but for their expertise. Cortez valued competence over connections, recruiting individuals with specific skill sets, logistics managers, financial wizards, and enforcers with military backgrounds. This meritocratic approach made the gang more sophisticated and less predictable than traditional street gangs. Operational security. Cortez's knowledge of police surveillance tactics informed every aspect of the gang's operations. Communications were heavily encrypted, and burner phones were used for every transaction. Meetings were held in rotating locations, often chosen at the last minute to avoid patterns that could be exploited. Lieutenants were trained to identify and counter surveillance. One lieutenant, for instance, was observed using tail-checking techniques typically taught in law enforcement. This training not only protected the gang, but also made it clear that Cortez had instilled his paranoia and precision in his subordinates. Recruitment and training. The gang's recruitment process was another innovation. New members were thoroughly vetted and trained before being allowed into the inner circle. This training included not only the basics of the gang's operations, but also how to spot undercover agents and recognize potential informants. Recruits were often tested with small, low-risk tasks before being trusted with larger responsibilities. Victor Ramos, one of Cortez's lieutenants who later cooperated with the investigation, described the training as like joining the army. He explained how Cortez drilled recruits on evasion tactics, surveillance awareness, and maintaining operational discipline. Ramos even described debriefings after major operations, during which Cortez would analyze what went wrong and how to improve. Compartmentalization. One of the most frustrating aspects of Cortez's gang was its compartmentalization. Each lieutenant and member only knew their specific role and immediate associates. For example, the individual managing drug shipments had no contact with the person handling money laundering. This meant that arresting one member rarely led to actionable intelligence about others in the organization. Ramos's cooperation broke this barrier. Facing significant prison time, he agreed to share what he knew about the gang structure. He revealed that Cortez communicated through encrypted messages or intermediaries, rarely meeting directly with his lieutenants. Ramos described Cortez as untouchable, a leader who stayed several steps ahead of law enforcement by minimizing his exposure. Structural challenges. The gang's decentralized structure and compartmentalization made traditional investigative methods ineffective. Arresting lower-level members yielded little information, forcing us to focus on high-value targets like lieutenants. Operational sophistication. The gang's training and counter-surveillance measures required us to think creatively. Every operation had to be meticulously planned to avoid detection, mirroring Cortez's own methods. The investigation reached a critical juncture when we intercepted a shipment of illegal firearms headed to one of Cortez's warehouses. This operation was based on intelligence provided by the undercover agent, who had gained enough trust to be privy to details of the gang's supply chain. The shipment, transported in 2 unmarked delivery trucks, was scheduled to arrive at a warehouse late at night. We mobilized a task force to intercept it en route. The operation required precision. Our goal was to seize the weapons and apprehend the drivers without alerting Cortez. When the trucks were stopped, the drivers claimed ignorance, insisting they had been hired through a third party and had no idea what they were transporting. Inside the trucks, we found over 100 firearms, including assault rifles, semi-automatic pistols, and shotguns, along with crates of ammunition. The drivers' claims of innocence were plausible. Cortez had used intermediaries to create layers of separation between himself and the shipment. The real breakthrough came when we searched the warehouse where the trucks were headed. Among the seized items were ledgers detailing the gang's operations, including payment records for weapons and transactions involving known associates of Cortez. One ledger contained an entry labeled Ghost Operations Fund, with a figure that matched deposits into one of the shell companies we had traced to Cortez. This was our first concrete link, tying him to the gang's activities. Our undercover agent, David, had been working his way closer to Cortez for months. The intercepted weapons shipment and the seizure of the ledgers provided a perfect opportunity to tighten the net. The gang was on edge, and Cortez called an emergency meeting with his lieutenants to discuss the situation. David was invited to attend, a major milestone in the operation. The meeting took place in the same industrial warehouse that had been under surveillance. Inside, Cortez exuded control, speaking with a calm authority that commanded respect. He outlined a plan to relocate key operations, warning his lieutenants to be vigilant. "They're getting close," he said, "but they won't touch us if we stay disciplined." David recorded the entire meeting using a concealed device. The recording provided a wealth of information, including details about the gang's plans, Cortez's methods of communication, and his contingency strategies. Most importantly, Cortez referred to the intercepted shipment and acknowledged his role in coordinating it. This was the smoking gun we needed to connect him to the operation. However, the meeting also underscored Cortez's paranoia. He reminded everyone to avoid taking unnecessary risks and warned against outsiders infiltrating their ranks. This placed David in a precarious position. If Cortez suspected him, the entire operation could collapse. With the ledger and the recordings from the meeting, we began unraveling Cortez's financial empire. His web of shell companies, cash-heavy businesses, and offshore accounts was intricate, but the pieces started to fall into place. Shell companies. One of the most significant findings was the discovery of a network of businesses registered under aliases or through straw owners. These companies, ranging from logistics firms to small storefronts, were used to funnel and launder money. Payments from drug deals, weapon sales, and extortion schemes flowed through these companies, creating the illusion of legitimate income. Offshore accounts. Cortez's expertise in concealing funds became evident when we traced transactions to accounts in the Cayman Islands and Panama. These accounts were registered under fake names and accessed through encrypted communication channels. While recovering the funds would require international cooperation, the transactions provided critical evidence of money laundering. The connection to the warehouse. A closer examination of the warehouse lease revealed that it was held by one of Cortez's shell companies. Payments for the lease were made through accounts tied to another shell company, creating a layered financial trail that he believed would be impossible to trace. However, our forensic accountants were able to connect the dots, tying the warehouse directly to Cortez. With overwhelming evidence in hand, we prepared to take Cortez down. Given his law enforcement background and likely access to weapons, the arrest operation required meticulous planning. The task force included SWAT teams, undercover operatives, and negotiators in case Cortez resisted. The operation was timed to coincide with another meeting at the warehouse, ensuring that Cortez would be on site and unprepared for a raid. Surveillance confirmed his arrival in a black SUV, and we moved in quickly, surrounding the warehouse. As expected, Cortez didn't surrender immediately. He barricaded himself inside with several lieutenants, refusing to communicate with negotiators. The standoff was tense. Cortez knew the playbook and used it to buy time, positioning himself defensively and attempting to secure escape routes. After several hours, tactical teams breached the warehouse, using non-lethal measures to subdue Cortez and his associates. Inside, we found additional ledgers, burner phones, encrypted communication devices, and a small arsenal of weapons. Cortez was taken into custody, his composure intact despite the overwhelming evidence against him. "You'll never make it stick," he said as he was led away, a final act of defiance. The arrest of Daniel Cortez marked the culmination of months of investigation, but the battle was far from over. As a former police officer, Cortez understood the legal system intimately. He knew how to exploit procedural weaknesses and had likely planned his defense long before his arrest. Bringing him to justice would require airtight evidence and, ideally, a confession. When Cortez was first brought in for questioning, he exuded a calm confidence, leaning back in his chair as if he were still in control. "You've got nothing on me," he said, a faint smirk playing on his lips. He denied all involvement with the gang and claimed he was merely a businessman who rented out warehouse space to various tenants. His tone was measured, and he spoke like someone accustomed to interrogations, a reminder of his years as an officer. However, the evidence against him was overwhelming. Interrogators presented the ledgers, surveillance footage, and recordings from the undercover agent, but Cortez deflected each point. He dismissed the recordings as fabricated and the financial records as misunderstandings. "You're reaching," he said. A bunch of circumstantial nonsense. To break Cortez's composure, the team employed a psychological strategy. They emphasized his betrayal of the badge, a tactic designed to exploit any lingering pride he had in his law enforcement identity. "You were one of us," the lead interrogator said. "You swore an oath, and now you're using everything you learned to destroy what we stand for. How do you live with yourself?" Cortez's expression hardened, but the subtle clenching of his jaw betrayed his irritation. He didn't respond immediately, but his body language showed he was rattled. The pressure increased when his lieutenants, arrested alongside him, began cooperating with investigators. One lieutenant, Victor Ramos, directly implicated Cortez in ordering hits, managing drug shipments, and laundering money. When confronted with Ramos's statements, Cortez's defiance wavered. He leaned forward, his tone sharp. "Victor doesn't know what he's talking about. He's just trying to save his own skin." The turning point came when interrogators presented a piece of evidence Cortez hadn't anticipated. A ledger entry detailing a payment labeled Ghost Operations Fund, tied directly to an account in the Cayman Islands under one of his aliases. This entry, coupled with the undercover agent's recordings of Cortez discussing the intercepted firearms shipment, created an irrefutable link between him and the gang's activities. Faced with the evidence, Cortez's bravado began to crack. He leaned back in his chair, silent for a long moment. "You don't understand how the system works," he finally said, his voice low. "It's broken, corrupt from top to bottom." Over the course of several hours, Cortez began to open up, not out of remorse, but out of a twisted need to justify his actions. He admitted to leading the gang, orchestrating its operations with the precision he had honed as a police officer. "I used what I knew," he said. "I didn't create the chaos. I just learned how to survive in it." Cortez framed himself as a victim of the system, claiming his resignation from the force was the result of a corrupt bureaucracy that refused to recognize his talent. "They pushed me out," he said. "So, I built something better, something where I was in control." He described how he had structured the gang to minimize risk, using his knowledge of law enforcement to stay one step ahead. "I knew how you'd come at me," he said. "I knew the weak spots, and I used them." Cortez's confession was chilling in its lack of remorse. He spoke about his crimes, drug trafficking, weapons smuggling, and extortion, with clinical detachment as if they were mere business decisions. "It wasn't personal," he said. "It was just strategy." While Cortez admitted to many aspects of the operation, he carefully avoided implicating himself in violent crimes, such as ordering hits on rivals or orchestrating kidnappings tied to the gang. These omissions were deliberate, designed to create doubt about the extent of his involvement. "I didn't hurt anyone," he claimed. "I just kept things running smoothly." Despite his denials, the evidence painted a different picture. Multiple lieutenants testified that Cortez had directly ordered acts of violence to protect the gang's interests. His attempts to distance himself from these crimes only underscored his awareness of their severity. Cortez's confession, though partial, was enough to solidify the prosecution's case. Combined with the financial records, surveillance footage, and testimonies from his lieutenants, it created an unassailable narrative of his leadership and criminal activities. His own words, recorded during the interrogation, would later be played in court, dismantling any remaining defense he might offer. Cortez's defiance during the interrogation highlighted the moral complexity of the case. He wasn't a typical criminal. He was a former protector of the law who had turned his knowledge and skills into tools of destruction. For me, the confession was both a victory and a sobering reminder of the damage one person can inflict when they betray their principles. If you like this story and want to watch more stories by Detective Lefebre, please subscribe to my channel and leave a comment below. Remember, the truth is in details.